And I want to thank first my partner and colleague, Chris Murphy. We have worked as a team for as long as both of us have been in the United States Senate on this issue of gun violence, on all of the measures that we have supported. And I thank him for his leadership in joining us today. And Jim Himes, my congressman from Fairfield County, will be joining us. He is actually on a train that is arriving as we speak in Union Station. I don't know whether he's on by phone or not, but he will be joining us as well. And I particularly want to thank the advocates who are here. Lisa Andrews, Director of Public Policy and Communications for the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Esperina Stubblefield, Director of the Umbrella Center for Domestic Violence Services at BH Care. And maybe most important, Mary Jackson, whom I first met after her daughter was killed in the horrific shooting that occurred in her home on May 7th, in the early hours of May 7th, 2014. When I first met her, her arm was still in a bandage and a sling, and she had the fortitude then and the courage to step forward, as she is doing today, to be a voice and face for this measure, and she will be speaking as well. And I thank her particularly for being on this call today. The Lori Jackson Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act aims to close a loophole that may seem technical and abstruse, but causes real life tragedies, deaths, and injuries as a result of domestic violence that turns deadly because it involves a gun. We know that domestic violence is a scourge that is prevalent in Connecticut and every state in the country. It's made 5 times more deadly when there is a gun in the house. It is a simple matter of real life death and injury caused by gun violence when guns are available to a domestic abuser. And the fact is that current federal law prevents domestic violence survivors, current federal law protects domestic violence survivors from gun violence by preventing their abusers from purchasing a firearm, but only if there is a permanent protective order. In other words, if the court issues a temporary protective order, which is the common practice in the first week or 10 days or 2 weeks after a protective order is sought, there is no prohibition against an abuser buying a gun. So at the time when the rage is greatest and the danger is highest, after an intimate partner has said she is leaving or it's over, the abuser can still buy a gun even with a temporary protective order. Closing this loophole is truly a matter of life and death. And so often, the victims and survivors have no voice. Their presence is invisible in this process. Closing this loophole is the aim of this measure. And it's named after Lori Jackson because on May 7th, 2014, she went to her parents' home with her 2 infant children and sought safety. But her estranged husband, under a temporary protective order, had access to a gun, went to the Jackson home, killed her with 4 shots and then severely injured Mary. This loophole exists throughout the country. Connecticut closed that loophole by state law, but other states have not done so. And the purpose of this measure is very simply to offer greater protection to those survivors and victims of domestic violence by saving their lives. The individuals who seek protection can go to shelters or other safe places. They can contact agencies like the 2 that are represented on this call, but they are still subject to that danger. And the danger has increased during this pandemic at times of higher stress, financial anxiety, emotional pressure, but also the difficulty of accessing services. And so the dangers of gun violence to domestic violence survivors has only increased. And of course, gun sales have also increased. Almost 23 million firearms were bought in 2020, and more than 2 million guns were bought in January 2021 alone. The pace of gun purchases is increasing. Domestic violence is a threat to women. The victims and survivors are principally women, is only increasing. And the danger of gun violence is even greater than ever before to those victims and survivors. So this measure is more urgent than ever. We should honor the survivors and victims like Lori Jackson with action, honor with action. And this measure, again, as I said at the outset, may seem technical, narrow, but it will save lives, and it will give voice and face to the victims and survivors of domestic violence who all too often are unseen. And they should be made visible, they should be given a voice, and that is what the advocates are doing today, and what thankfully Mary Jackson has done since 2014, when I first met her and she stepped forward. So thank you, Mary. And let me now turn to Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Dick. And I know we're waiting for Jim Himes to join us. I don't think I can add a lot to the very good summary that Senator Blumenthal provided. I want to thank him for his leadership on this issue. As you mentioned, we work very closely together on all of these issues related to changing the trajectory of gun violence in America. And glad to partner with him on this. Thank you, Mary, for continuing to speak truth to power. Thank you to Liza and the advocates on the call for the great work that you do in Connecticut on behalf of victims. Sociologists refer to something called Vercoe's law. Vercoe's law is an important principle in the study of violence. What it shows is that as violence rates decline in a civilization, the stickiest kind of violence, the kind of violence whose numbers drop last after every other kind of violence, is domestic violence. It's proof, unfortunately and tragically, of how baked into our culture and our society domestic and spousal violence is. Because as all sorts of other violence starts to abate in a civilization or a society, it's that partner on partner violence, that male on female violence that lingers. Fortunately, we have identified interventions that make a difference. And as Senator Blumenthal said, preventing access to a firearm, especially at those critical moments when a wife or a girlfriend knows their life may be in danger. It saves lives. In states that require everybody to go through a background check before they buy a weapon, there are 40% less domestic homicides. It gives you a window into how effective changing gun laws is when trying to address domestic violence. And what we know in Lori's case is that the existing laws are not sufficient. Mary can tell this story very personally, but Lori and Mary did everything they should have done. Lori went to court and filed a restraining order. She did everything the law allowed her to do in order to keep her spouse from hurting her and her kids. She removed herself from the home. She installed a new alarm system along with Mary at their new home. And yet that still wasn't enough. And so it's really important for us to recognize that changing gun laws has a positive downward effect on the rates of domestic violence. It's important for us to recognize the laws that are on the books today are not good enough. It's important for us to recognize that while it's difficult to push down rates of domestic violence, it's not impossible. So Dick and I are going to fight really hard to get this passed or to get it included in a broader collection of reforms. We think that the politics on this issue have fundamentally changed. Republicans used to reflexively fight these changes in laws, but because of the political power that has grown around the anti-gun violence movement, because of the powerful stories of survivors of violence like Mary, we're winning more converts. We're making it harder for Republicans to stand on the outside. And so we hope to be able to bring some of these bills before the Senate, before the House later this year. We hope to be able to make a difference for victims. So I see Jim is joining us fresh off of
Jim is on.
Transport, so I'll hand it over to him.
Are you ready, Jim, or do you want some time? I know you've just settled in and fired up your.
All set. Thank you, senators. I don't know if I'm coming through. I just got off the train and I'm borrowing Senator Blumenthal's conference room here. Thank you very much, Senator. But I really am deeply grateful to both of you for inviting me to be part of this announcement. This is, of course, an effort that has been a long time coming. We have deep, sadly, personal understanding of the problems of gun violence in the state of Connecticut across the board, whether it's unsecured firearms, mass killings, or, of course, the violence perpetrated by domestic partners, boyfriends, girlfriends, that sort of thing. And so this legislation is very much in the spirit of achieving what we want to achieve, which is to make sure that access to firearms is limited to responsible, nonviolent, non-threatening Americans. And the senators and I had our own experience just 2 months ago with violence here on Capitol Hill. None of us, none of the members nor senators were killed, but there were fatalities and there were people who were intent on committing violence against us and others. And so we had a very personal reminder of what it must be like for those victims of domestic violence to know that the individual who perpetrated that violence is at large and quite possibly armed. That is a level of anxiety that that nobody should have to live with. Where, as the senators have pointed out, very fortunate to be from the state of Connecticut, where this was addressed at the state level. Though we have had more than our fair share of gun violence in the state of Connecticut, that is a protection that should be afforded to every single American, consistent with the notion that the Second Amendment entitles Americans to keep and bear arms. It does not entitle either those who have demonstrated violence or behavior that could lead to violence to further threaten and terrify those who have been victims of the violence that they perpetrated. So again, thank you for making this accommodation, but I did want to be part of this ongoing effort, so ably led by the Connecticut delegation to try to bring an end to the uniquely American epidemic of gun violence that we all sadly experience every single day.
Thanks, Jim. As you, Jim, and Chris have mentioned, Connecticut has closed this loophole. Connecticut has some of the strongest gun violence prevention laws in the country, and Connecticut has shown that these laws work. They reduce gun violence. They reduce the numbers of deaths and injuries from gun violence, including for domestic violence survivors. And that is solid evidence that has been helpful to us in making the case here in the Congress for these kinds of laws. And in fact, these stories have helped grow a grassroots political movement that has been demonstrated in congressional elections over the last 2 cycles when pro-gun violence prevention members of Congress have been elected in the House. And it has convinced us that we can overcome the vice-like grip of the gun lobby. In fact, the NRA has imploded and has weakened significantly over these past couple of elections. I think you're absolutely right, Jim, that the recent experience of our colleagues under threat and firearms were collected in the wake of that assault on the Capitol will be compelling also. Let me now turn to Mary Jackson, who has stepped forward every time I have asked her to appear with us. This measure is really named after her daughter, but it is due to her courage and fortitude, her strength and bravery in the face of tragedy. And thank you so much, Mary, for being a part of this event.
I want to thank everyone who's worked so hard at bringing this forward and starting it again, because it does mean an awful lot to our family. I've tried not to break down. But Lori was with us for 5 weeks after she left her estranged husband. And all that time we felt threatened. He was always under a temporary restraining order because he fled. And she actually went down and renewed it, but they could never find him. But he actually bought his gun legally in Virginia. And to me, that's really sad. We'd love to see an end to this. If we could save another family from facing the tragedy that we faced. We lost so much that day. And we would just love to be part of it. And anything we could do, we're there. It means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Let's turn now to Liz Andrews, who is the Director of Public Policy and Communications at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Liz.
Sure, thank you, Senator. First, I would like to thank you, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, Representative Himes, for their continued leadership on issues impacting the safety of domestic violence survivors, and of course, the Jacksons for their courage in sharing their story in honor of Lori. You have all been true champions, and for that, CCADV and our 18-member organizations are grateful. The bill being introduced today provides comprehensive protection at the absolute most dangerous time for any victim of domestic violence, which is when they are starting to take steps to leave. Domestic violence at its core is about control. When a victim begins to signal that they are ready to leave, such as they would by filing for a restraining order, the abuser will begin to feel that they are losing control and may escalate abusive behaviors. As you've already heard, research has demonstrated that domestic violence and access to firearms can be a deadly combination. According to the Connecticut Domestic Violence Fatality Review Task Force, between 2000 and 2018, 278 people were killed by an intimate partner in Connecticut. 86% of those killed were women, and 1/3 were current or former dating partners. Firearms remain the single most commonly used weapon in those homicides, used 39% of the time. Again, leaving is the most dangerous time for victims. It is during this time more than ever when they need protection from firearms. If a judge is issuing an order acknowledging that a person poses a danger to someone else, that person should not have access to firearms, and that protection should begin upon issuance of the order, not weeks later. We urge Congress to pass this common sense measure that provides comprehensive protection for victims when it is most needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Esperina Stubblefield is the director of the Umbrella Center for Domestic Violence Services at BH Care.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Senator, for this opportunity. Senator Chris Murphy, Senator Jim, for being here today and really for supporting this bill. I speak to about as one of the member organization, but really feeling being with the Jackson family, serving them. Unfortunately, after Lori's death, you know, I'm really impacted seeing what she means to them and seeing the thousands of women. Every year we serve, last year we served over 8,000 men and women in our services. And we know firsthand, we hear firsthand what they're experiencing, how scared they are with their abusers. So having this law, not that it will stop violence, but it really would give them an amount of safety that they will feel that they don't have to be scared in their own home. So who wants to be scared in their home? So it would mean so much to be able to have something in place that will give them a certain amount of safety and not having to live every day being afraid of their lives. So thank you so much for all you've done to bring us to this place and for pushing on for victims of domestic violence every day. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. And before we go to questions, let me just emphasize a point that Lisa Andrews made. In those first days, when an intimate partner says it's over, the danger is at its highest and the protection is lowest. Because even where a victim or survivor does the right thing in seeking a protective order, it's only a temporary protective order. And there is no federal prohibition against buying a gun. There is such a prohibition when it is a permanent protective order, as happens after a week or 14 days in most states. And this measure provides due process because there is the normal right to a hearing after a week or 10 days on that temporary protective order. It simply says, whether it's temporary or permanent, a protective order bars the purchase of a firearm, which is the current law. And it closes that loophole for temporary protective orders. So I thank you, Lisa Andrews and Esperina Stubblefield, and most important, Mary Jackson, for being on the call. And let's go to the question.
Hi, Senators. This is Emily Munson from Hearst Newspapers. Thank you for holding the call today, and Representative Himes. Senators, this question is for you. I was wondering if you are part of the group who's working with Senator Durbin on the VAWA reauthorization in the Senate to ensure that this provision will be in the bill in the Senate version, and what sort of outreach you've been doing to get Republican support in the Senate for the provision. Thank you.
Great question, Emily. Yes, I am working with Senator Durbin. This bill has gone through the Judiciary Committee traditionally. I'm very hopeful that it will again. It has passed in Congresses before now with a bipartisan majority. I'm very hopeful that it will, and that it will include this kind of measure, because it is so important as a matter of the Violence Against Women Act. VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, that it provide this kind of protection. And we need this national standard because we do have some of the strongest gun laws in the country that protect women in Connecticut. But guns have no respect for state borders. So for example, Lori Jackson's estranged husband, was able to access a gun out of state, as Mary said. And this story is powerful evidence for passing VAWA and including this kind of protection, closing the loophole in this measure.
I would just add VAWA, when I got to the Congress a decade ago, VAWA was one of the least political, least partisan pieces of legislation we would consider. Republicans and Democrats would come together, we'd come to a conclusion, get it passed. It has now become politicized because Republicans are not as interested as Democrats in protecting women from gun violence and also protecting immigrants and migrants from domestic violence. And so last session, the House passed VAWA, but Mitch McConnell wouldn't take it up in the Senate. With a change in control of the Senate, we now have the chance to rectify that wrong. We can pass a update to VAWA that, while it might be controversial inside the Senate, it is not controversial out in the American public. So my hope is, I'm not on the Judiciary Committee, so Dick will likely work, more closely on the details of VAWA than I will as a non-committee member. But my hope is that we'll be able to bring it up for a vote this year, both in the House and the Senate.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up, which is for Senator Blumenthal, if you're already starting to work on this with Senator Durbin, do you know if you're picking up the negotiations where they left off between Senator Ernst and Senator Feinstein, or is this issue sort of starting afresh in the new Congress?
Emily, I can't go into the details of the negotiations. There are others involved in them besides those two. And as you may know, there will be a hearing this coming week, the week after this one, on gun violence in the Judiciary Committee. So I think it will be announced, I believe, today that this hearing is going forward, and it will provide an occasion for us to consider these kinds of measures.
Thanks for taking my questions.
This is Ann Givens from the Trace, and I'm just wondering if you can explain a little bit about the thinking behind introducing this bill individually and a similar portion of the VAWA legislation simultaneously.
Well, this legislation could be standalone, could be passed on its own. We've introduced a series of measures on gun violence. Ethan's Law, named after Ethan's song, who was tragically killed as a result of shooting in a neighbor's home because of unsafely stored firearm. Senator Murphy, I've led on that one. Senator Murphy has led on universal background checks, which has been introduced. We're going ahead on this one today. The Violence Against Women Act could encompass it, but we have introduced a series of measures, and there'll be more against gun violence. So I would say very simply, this measure deserves to be introduced on its own, to be passed independently of any other, but all the better if it's combined with VAWA. Anyone else?
I have a question for Ms. Jackson, if she's willing to take a question.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you are involved in outreach to members of the Senate or other members of Congress on this issue.
No, I really haven't. Only been working with Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks for speaking with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Other questions? I think we may be at the end. Thank you all for joining us, and really appreciate Jim, you're rushing over here from the train station, from Union Station, and thanks to Chris Murphy for his leadership as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.